Hey class, happy Monday. While we are in remote learning for the next week and a half, I wanted to take some time to do some lessons about how lumber gets to us in the shop. So, thinking about how timber is managed when it's standing out in the woods to when it gets to us in various different products. So, today I just want to go over a little bit about timber management, TSI, what is that and why is it important, invasive species that are in the woods that should be gotten rid of so that we have good standing timber. Tomorrow I want to talk about timber harvesting, what types of harvests can be done and why they do that. Oftentimes, people hear things like clear cut and they think it's a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. And I just want to talk about the different types of cuts that can be done. I want to talk about harvesting methods, how they get lumber out of the woods efficiently and in an environmentally friendly way. What happens after the logs are hauled off to a sawmill? Take a look at some of that equipment. Some of it's pretty interesting. I want to talk a little bit about different wood products that are then made with those logs that are harvested. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about purchasing lumber once it's been sawn up and it's in the form that you and I purchase to use in our shops. So today I want to look at the school woods. I'm back at the trailhead of the school woods. If you don't recognize where I'm at, it's the one that's back behind the baseball fields. And the school woods is a great place to talk about timber management because it has both good and bad examples of managing timber. The outside of the woods, there's not really a lot done with it, and it's poorly managed, and you can see, looking at the timber, you can see the result of poor management. But if we go further into the woods, you can see where the timber actually has been managed really, really well. They've done several timber harvests out of the school woods in the past 20 years, and there's still a lot of good timber left there, and there's a lot of good saplings that are growing that can be harvested here in another 30 or 40 years. So there's good examples and there's bad examples. So first I want to talk about the bad examples, what you don't want to see a lot of in the woods and what you can do to clean out your woods if you do have a lot of invasive species. So behind me here is the first example of an invasive species that is most commonly found in woods around here. It's all across Ohio and lots of other places, and that would be Multiflora rose. If my camera guy would come a little closer. Multiflora rose is the plant that you see here that's kind of surrounding these cherry trees. Black kind of cornflaky bark there is a cherry tree. And this stuff here is Multiflora rose. For those of you who are out in the woods hunting and riding four-wheelers and that sort of thing, you probably have seen this all the time. For those of you who haven't, it has thorns on it. You can't walk through it. It's awful stuff. And it also is really easily identified by these bright red berries that it gets in the fall. Multiflora rose came here from Europe. Like a lot of invasive species, the plants that we don't want to have here, they came from some other continent. We didn't start out having Multiflora rose and lots of other plants and animals and rodents and all bugs and all that kind of stuff. That wasn't always in North America, but it is now. All of that stuff was brought here with good intentions. Multiflora rose was brought here, one, for the berries. They are good for wildlife. Birds, rodents, deer, lots and lots of animals eat the red berries. So that helped attract things that at the time people were trying to hunt to keep themselves alive. The other reason Multiflora rose spread so rapidly is because people used it as a living fence row after the Dust Bowl. Multiflora rose roots very easily in all kinds of soil, and it's really hard to kill once it's rooted, and it does make this nice mass that you can't get through. So organizations actually encouraged people to plant Multiflora rose as a living hedge just to keep their soil in place in the 1930s, 1940s, around the Dust Bowl time when soil erosion was such a problem. So people planted it everywhere. And now we have it everywhere because the berries spread through birds and things like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to have around. It just becomes a problem if your entire forest floor is covered in Multiflora rose because of its mounding habit. I'm stuck. As you can see, there's not a whole lot of other stuff that's going to grow underneath the Multiflora rose. It doesn't have its leaves on it right now because it's the middle of November, but when it does, it just covers everything. And so anything underneath it is never going to get access to sunlight, and therefore it's never going to grow. So if you're thinking about timber management, this is a problem because your saplings, even if tree seeds were to get down into the soil and they were to germinate, they're going to have a hard time doing that because they're not going to be able to get through that big mass. But even if they did get down into the soil and they germinated, once they germinate, they're not going to have any sunlight because that multiflora rose is covering everything and it's dominating and it's not going to let anything grow. So you might have standing trees that look really good right now, but if your woods is completely covered in multiflora rose in the understory, you're not going to have any new trees growing, and eventually you're going to end up with a bunch of old timber that you're either going to harvest or that's going to die and fall, and you're not going to be left with anything new that's growing. So that becomes problematic. Go ahead and pause for a second. Good? Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm not the most tech savvy person, as you all already know. Example number 2 over here is grapevine. Another invasive species that did not come from here. It does have some positive aspects, but overall it's not really something that you want to see in a woods if you are managing it for timber that you want to harvest. Grapevine is another one of those things that you see all over Ohio, and if you spend any time in the woods, you've probably seen it before. We used to run through the woods, and my siblings and I, when we were little, and we would swing on it and pretend to be Tarzan, but we really shouldn't have been so excited that we had grapevine that was that big in the woods. What grapevine does is it kind of girdles a tree, and it will climb a tree, and it will eventually pull a tree down. You can kind of see what happened here with this dead tree in front of me. The tree did not die because it had grapevine on it. There was probably another cause. There's a lot of holes in it. My guess is it had some type of an insect pest that actually killed the tree. But this grapevine winds around the tree and probably led to what actually pulled the tree down, once it had died. But grapevine can also do that to live trees. So if you look up into the tree, you can see that the grapevine is just kind of going to grow and wrap itself around the bushes, almost like a snake, really. It reminds me of snakes. Even if it doesn't pull a tree down, it will damage a tree. It will pull limbs off, it will girdle parts of the tree and cause all kinds of growth abnormalities, and pretty much it'll just make a tree unsaleable if it doesn't just kill it. So grapevine does produce food, again, for wildlife, and that's why it was brought here. Put it in the woods, it encourages wildlife to come, you have something to hunt, this is great. Later we learned that that's not so great because it began to actually impact the good timber that was out in the woods to be harvested. So now it's on the invasive species list, and it's something that foresters and landowners are trying to get rid of so that we continue to have a supply of good timber to harvest. There's one more really common invasive species that's back in the woods here at United, and I want to show you that real quick. This is the third invasive species that we have back in the school woods that I want to talk about. This is bush honeysuckle, and it is a woody shrub. Some plants grow foliage, and then that completely dies back. A woody plant grows branches, and then it just continues to grow from those branches year to year. Those plants are actually even harder to get rid of. So bush honeysuckle is an invasive species that's kind of at the top of the list as far as hard to get rid of, and it is extremely invasive. It spreads very, very easily through wildlife and also humans. Bush honeysuckle it gets a pretty flower on it, and it smells really, really good when it blooms. So people plant it all over their yards and around their houses and that sort of thing. And that's why it was brought here. Again, it didn't come from here. It's not supposed to be here. But people brought it here just as an ornamental plant. It's easily spread to the woods, and once it's out in the woods, it's really hard, to manage it and get rid of it when needed. And so you see it everywhere. It's not just in the school woods. It's all over the place. And it still does have leaves on it. They are throughout the year bright green, and they're actually one of the last plants that's out in the woods that loses its leaves. So if you're wandering around and you see a shorter shrub that still has these bright green leaves on it, most likely it's bush honeysuckle. In the spring, they are the ones that they have little white, um, kind of boomerang shaped flowers on them, and they smell really, really good. So those are 3 invasives that we've got out here that really, if you are managing timber to sell, you want to control those invasive species. And there's a whole bunch of other ones. Privet is a huge one, something called autumn olive. There's tree of heaven, which is also called ailanthus. There's burning bush, which is another ornamental shrub that people plant all over their yards because it's really, really bright red in the fall and it's really pretty. So these things, they're brought here for what we thought was a good purpose, but if you're looking at the woods from a timber management standpoint, these are negative plants. You don't want to have these in the woods. Because again, just like Montiflora rose, something like bush honeysuckle covers the understory and it prevents everything else from growing. So you're not going to have any new saplings growing. If you have good trees now, great, but in a few years, you're not going to. We try to eliminate these from the woods if you are growing, because you want to have a timber harvest. And there's a couple ways you can do that. The first thing I want to mention is that if you have more than 10 acres of forested property, you can be considered for something called CAUV, which stands for Current Agricultural Use Value.
Or Ohio Forestry
Or you can also qualify under a program called Ohio Forestry Tax Law. And basically you get a tax break for managing your forest. So it's kind of an incentive to get rid of invasive species and try to manage your forest well so that there's standing timber that can be harvested eventually. And it's a significant amount of money off of your taxes for doing that. One beneficial thing that most people are encouraged to do is have a forester come out and walk your property with you